In 2003, Bill Goldberg had finally arrived in WWE, but he soon ended up in a backstage fight with Chris Jericho, a man basically half his size, and somehow it was Jericho who walked away looking like the winner. It wasn't just some random scrap either, this was the blow off to a feud that had been going on for years. By 1998, WCW was still riding the wave of the NWO storyline. For wrestlers who weren't involved in the New World Order and were under 6 feet tall, the Cruiserweight division was where you could usually find them. Jericho was one of them, but he was determined to break out of that Cruiserweight prison. He reinvented himself as an arrogant loudmouth who called people out and had tantrums when things didn't go his way. The very fact that he was talking put him head and shoulders above all the other cruiserweights, and it certainly started to get him noticed. On the other side of the locker room stood Bill Goldberg. He was a former NFL player and an absolute wrecking ball who smashed through the roster, and he quickly became WCW's ultimate babyface. And this is where the divide between him and Jericho really became obvious. Jericho had clawed his way up the hard way, starting out in the Hart family dungeon, then spending years in Mexico, Japan and ECW. He learnt the basics the hard way, grinding away for years to get to WCW. Goldberg's road was the opposite. He spent a few months in WCW's power plant and was put on TV almost straight away. He didn't have any experience, but WCW pushed him like a megastar. One of these men had to fight for every scrap of credibility, while the other was handed instant success. By 1998, Jericho decided the best way to start climbing the ladder was to go after Goldberg, so he started cutting promos mocking the undefeated streak and made fun of Goldberg's entrance with the security guards and the sparklers. There was one hilarious segment where he got lost on the journey from his locker room to the ring, which took inspiration from the movie Spinal Tap. This also introduced us to Ralphus, who was the head of Jericho personal security. This ridiculous looking middle-aged man briefly became a cult icon in WCW. He was actually one of the company's truck drivers that Jericho had spotted backstage. At Full Brawl, he wrestled Dwarfberg and then bragged that he was now 1-0 against the champ. Then he challenged Goldberg directly to a match, despite everyone knowing that he wasn't in the building. Now Jericho was bragging that he was 2-0 up, and the fans couldn't wait to see Goldberg finally tear him apart. And that was exactly the point. Jericho pitched the idea himself. He'd run his mouth and build all this heat, and then get steamrolled by Goldberg in seconds on pay-per-view. It would be quick, it would be funny, and it would make Goldberg look even more unstoppable. But Goldberg wanted nothing to do with it, saying that he didn't do comedy bullshit and that Jericho would pay the price for mocking him. Jericho was stunned by that response. They'd actually been friendly with each other before, even having gone to a hockey game together. He tried to explain to him that the fans weren't laughing at him, they were laughing at Jericho, and that he'd look even stronger. But Goldberg wasn't having any of it. It didn't help that Kevin Nash and a few of the other guys were stoking the fire backstage. They were in Goldberg's ear, telling him that Jericho was out of line, winding him up even more. So while Jericho was out there doing some of the best heel work of his WCW run, Goldberg was backstage getting mad. Fans wanted to see the payoff so badly. They were ready for Goldberg to finally crush Jericho in the ring, but it never came. By November 1998, Jericho was told that the angle was done, that he'd be losing to Goldberg on Nitro, and that would be the end of it. But Jericho wasn't happy with that, so he went straight to Bischoff's office. When he got there, he found Goldberg was already in the room talking to him. Jericho pitched the idea again to both of them. 30 seconds on pay-per-view, the biggest squash match WCW had ever seen. He said people would pay money to watch Goldberg finally shut him up. Goldberg briefly saw sense and agreed to go ahead with the angle, and they even set up a segment for later that night on Nitro. But just a week later, Goldberg changed his mind, and the feud was cancelled. Eric Bischoff later said that he didn't see Jericho on Goldberg's level, but that just shows that he completely missed the point. Jericho never wanted to be treated as Goldberg's equal. His whole idea was to get squashed in 30 seconds flat, so at least he'd be seen as more than just another cruiserweight. He certainly didn't expect to be seen as a main event superstar afterwards. But this was when Jericho knew that he was done with the company. If he couldn't even get booked in a squash match against Goldberg, then he was never going to get anywhere in WCW. In 1999, Jericho debuted for the WWF, interrupting The Rock and immediately becoming more famous than he'd ever been in WCW. It wasn't until 2003 that the men would meet again, but by now Jericho had established himself as one of WWE's biggest stars and a multiple-time champion. Meanwhile, Goldberg had finally signed with WWE, and the company was banking on him to be their next big main event superstar. The fans popped huge for his debut, but he soon turned out to be a disappointment. They booked him in long, competitive matches and loaded him up with promos. The problem was, Goldberg wasn't built for either of those things, and this run was a huge letdown. And backstage, things weren't much better. On his very first day, he walked right up behind Jericho and slapped him hard on the back. To Jericho, it wasn't a friendly greeting. He saw it as disrespect. And allegedly, Goldberg was running Jericho down to the other guys behind his back, saying that he never sold for him in WCW and that he'd been bad-mouthing him online. Jericho was very angry about this, and he made it clear to Vince McMahon that he wasn't going to let Goldberg walk in and start throwing his weight around like he did back in the day. One night backstage in Milwaukee, Jericho heard from Kevin Nash that Goldberg had been burying him again, saying that he didn't know how to sell and didn't want to do business in WCW. And so Jericho stormed into the locker room and confronted him. He made it clear that this wasn't WCW anymore, and if Goldberg had something to say, then he should do it to his face. Goldberg laughed in his face and then grabbed him by the throat. Jericho smacked his hand away, shoved him, and then when Goldberg tried to take him down, he sidestepped him and got him in a front face lock. Despite the huge size gap between them, Jericho controlled the fight. Obviously, his training in the Hart family dungeon gave him the advantage. In his book, Jericho said, "He got to his feet again and we busted through the doors at the back of the dressing room, straight into the hallway filled with surprised fans who got a bonus match that night. We scuffled back into the dressing room and were finally broken up by Arn Anderson, Terry Taylor, Hurricane, Christian and Booker T. As Christian and Hurricane were restraining me, they were inadvertently setting me up to be murdered at the same time, because when Goldsworthy broke free of the pack, they still had my arms pinned to my sides. 'Let go, he's going to kill me,' I screamed, closing my eyes and preparing to have my face caved in. They realised what was going on and let me go at the last minute, but it was too late. He broke through and reared his fist back. I tensed up and prepared for him to knock my block off, but he started pulling my hair instead. I couldn't believe that the mighty Berggold was tugging at my hair like a 5-year-old during playtime. What was up with this guy? I figured if he hadn't knocked me out yet, he was never going to, so I pried his hand out of my hair and pie-faced him as hard as I could. He stumbled back and stared at me in surprise. I was done with this bitch fight, and I screamed, "What the hell is wrong with you, man? You're acting like a goof." Goldrush screamed back, "Your mother is a fucking goof." Booker T got the most quizzical look on his face as he chewed on the unlit cigar he always seemed to have in his mouth, and said, "Hold up, did you just say his mother is a fucking goof? That's the worst insult I ever heard, man." Jericho told him straight, either shake hands and move on, or fight each other every week until someone quit. Goldberg shook his hand, but the damage to his aura was already done. I walked back to my chair and saw a text on my phone from Disco Inferno, who had already heard that Goldbone and I had gotten into a fight. It had been 10 minutes. Telephone, telegraph, tele-wrestler. For the next week, everybody I knew in the business called or pulled me aside to ask me about the big fight. I was forced to relay the lion's tale over and over again to everyone from Bruce Pritchard to Jim Ross to Jerry Briscoe to the champ himself. I still get asked about it all the time. In a way, I feel bad for Bill, as deep down I know that he's got a good heart, but when our international incident happened, it really got him off on the wrong foot, with a lot of guys in the dressing room. When the word got out that David had taken down Goliath, I gained admiration, while Goldberg gained more resentment than he already had. Vince publicly scolded Jericho for not telling him about the scale of the feud between them, although afterwards he sent Jericho a text message telling him that he found the whole thing to be hilarious. On TV, WWE decided to cash in on the heat. Jericho cut promos digging at Goldberg, bringing up the WCW situation and pointing out how the fans were booing him. It all built to the Bad Blood pay-per-view. Goldberg finally beat Jericho clean with a jackhammer, just like everyone expected. But in the locker room, nobody cared about the scripted finish. What they remembered was that night in Milwaukee where Jericho had embarrassed him, for real. It wasn't long before Goldberg was gone from the company, and of course Jericho's career continued to go from strength to strength. But over time, the tension between the men cooled off, and by 2022, the feud was finally buried for good. Goldberg came on Jericho's podcast, where they admitted the whole thing had been fueled by other people. Today, Jericho calls Goldberg a great friend, and he still laughs about that night in Milwaukee, but he's quick to add that he never wants to fight Goldberg for real, ever again.